Hey internets, this video is going to be about all the little tricks and word salad and various disingenuous tactics that journos use in order to trick the populace into believing things that are just objectively not true. I've somewhat gone over this and outlined it in a high octane video I did in the past, where I gave kind of a general idea of how the media is deceptive. But this video is going to focus a bit more on specific examples, such as this recent ridiculous thing with Vtubergate, where a few VTubers, namely Kirsche, but a few other girls, have been the target of just a blatantly ridiculous smear campaign. But I'll also be throwing in some other articles as well, because it's really important to understand just how common it is for corporate statist media journoids to lie. Because unfortunately we've kind of reached a point where the most popular media outlets, well, they don't really hire journalists for honesty. Rather, instead they're hired based on their ability to twist things to suit a certain narrative. And sadly, pretty much all major news outlets do this to some degree. In fact, even many famous journalists and famous media pundits, such as even Tucker Carlson, for example, have even publicly admitted that much of what people see on the media and news and TV, just in general, is really just nothing more than propaganda. And so the time has come to see just how far this rabbit hole goes, so we can all refine our skills in detecting this propaganda. And really just a lot of what our corporate statist mainstream media has to say tends to be focused more on pushing deceptive narratives than an honest reporting of reality. So I'm proud to be partnered with Ground News. As I've said before, Ground News is a lot more than just another news source. It is a brilliantly designed service that lets us sort through all the news and see through media bias in mere minutes, as opposed to the countless hours that it would normally take you to research and see through statist media deception without the features they provide. A good example of this, since this video is about journalist tactics, let's look at a really popular topic right now, which is that massive GOP spending bill that's currently making its way through Congress. Or the big beautiful bill, as some people are calling it. And Ground News lets us clearly see how different journos are reporting on this bill in completely different ways. For example, left-leaning sources tend to use more negative loaded language such as "grew weary," and of course the doom and gloom of cutting certain welfare programs. While we can also quickly see how right-leaning articles along with the White House focus more on the benefits of tax cuts, and of course it's just again a big beautiful bill gonna be the most bestest spendingest package ever. And of course Ground News provides us with a lot of features that lets you understand what's going on a lot faster and a lot easier. So for instance, the Ground AI section gives us a quick rundown. The bill includes $5 trillion in tax cuts, which does include some welfare cuts, resulting in some Democrat pushback. Ground News also gives us coverage details and a bias distribution chart, which shows just how many sources are reporting on the issue, which sources they are, and also where those sources tend to lie on the political spectrum. This is very useful because you can also click on the publications to be taken straight to the article, which means that Ground News kind of gives you a simple hub that lets you quick navigate. We also get general stats, such as how many news sources are reporting on subjects, the percentage bias distribution, frequency of updates, etc., etc. This is again why I use Ground News to help with a lot of the research for many of my videos. It's much faster than trudging through journo nonsense manually. They also have Blind Spot, which is a feature specifically designed to help you see through publication bias, so which stories are disproportionately over and underreported by different political factions. In other words, the common journo tactic of simply not reporting on events that are unfavorable to their ideology. Overall, Ground News is designed to help you save time and energy. And they also remain independent and subscriber funded. So to gain access to these features, go to ground.news/MentisWave or scan my QR code to get 40% off the Vantage plan, which will grant you unlimited access. But anyway, in order to make this video easier to understand, I'm going to be going over these various tactics of journalist sophistry, somewhat in order from easiest to spot to the more difficult to spot, because some of them require you to notice the other first before you really understand just how much a journoid is lying. So let's start with the first obvious one, which is poisoning the well in the headline. This one's pretty straightforward, I've gone over it before, but the latest sort of Vtubergate happening really shows some ridiculous examples, such as this title from Vice Gaming: VTubing has an elephant in the room, bigotry. And one thing that people don't realize is that headlines don't really need to have any hint of truth to them. Journos can write whatever the heck they want in the headline, and it's technically not lying so long as they clarify things in the actual article itself. So for example, in this case, when you read the article, you'll quickly realize that the accusation of lay bigotry is based entirely on opinions and entirely on cherry picking, which we'll get into later. In other examples, sometimes a more objective statement is then later swapped out for a more subjective statement. So for example, this one from Mail Online that was pointed out by fullfact.org. Coronavirus is causing deadly new inflammatory fever in some children, British study finds. And then later it goes to a study of 8 cases has suggested that the syndrome may be caused by coronavirus. Which, of course, 8 cases, if you're familiar with studies, 8 is a very, very, very low, almost meaningless sample size. And then, of course, it's swapped out for the word maybe, which means that the journalist doesn't really know. They're just saying a more objective, inflammatory statement in the headline in order to trick you into clicking on it and trick you into believing something that isn't really true. And so again, because they don't really need to have the headline matching the article, journos can pretend like they know more or have more data than they actually have. I mean, in fact, just the general phenomenon of clickbait shows you that journos don't really need to have the headline match the article at all. And so the important takeaway here is that you really should just pay no attention to headlines, period. Journos can say anything in headlines. Legitimately anything. And as long as they clarify it in the article itself, it's not directly lying. And so that's kind of where a lot of these tactics of sophistry come into. They're just ways to lie without actually lying, or just mislead people using fallacies or other sleights of hand. And going back to that Vice article, the entire point of this headline is just to get people riled up. Ooh, oh no, it's lay bigotry, as if it's some kind of statement of fact, when it absolutely is not. Hence why it's also the most common form of poisoning the well. The point of the headline isn't to tell you anything that's true, but rather it's to trick people's mind into thinking and feeling a certain way. Journos do it so that they can then lie to you, trick you into believing that lie, and then get away with it by clarifying it later, but then because the well has already been poisoned, a lot of people won't see through the lie or see through or even notice the clarification. But anyways, TLDR, it's just important to understand that headlines mean nothing. They have no value at all. Journos can say anything here, and they do. Next up is just the good old-fashioned ad hominem, which again you might just notice in this Vtubergate headline from Vice again. Oh, she's a bigot. This person's a bad, evil, no good, mean person. Again, it's just to pull at people's emotions and get them riled up. They don't actually need any evidence of it. And this may seem obvious, but sometimes it can get really sly. For example, one thing of ad hominem that a lot of people fall for is what I like to call the hit piece by proxy. Rather than directly writing a hit piece or directly calling someone a bad, evil, mean person, a journo might instead just cite somebody else and what their opinion is in order to make a hit piece. For example, this one from The Guardian. Steve Bannon condemns Elon Musk as racist and truly evil. Now, when we look at this journo's profile, we can pretty easily tell that this person probably doesn't like either Elon Musk or Steve Bannon. So really the point of this article is just so that he can clown on Musk by just focusing on some rightoid infighting. And one thing that's particularly brilliant about this strategy, or nefarious depending on which way you put it, is that in the hit piece by proxy, if something the proxy states later turns out to be untrue, the journo can just point to the proxy and blame the proxy. Which leads us to kind of start to understand the journoid mindset of dishonesty in general. Because again, journos are hired more on their ability to twist the narrative than tell the truth. A lot of journos, they get away with being outright libelous and slanderous, and again, saying things that aren't true, by following this general strategy of dishonesty with an exit plan. Journos will rarely outright say something that is 100% untrue. What they do instead is they'll tell you something that's untrue, but with some kind of excuse built into that untruth that they can later use to kind of slime away if people spot them lying. And the hit piece by proxy is one of the more obvious examples of that, because the proxy can say anything, and if it later turns out to be untrue or libel, regardless of context, the journo can always slime away from that by saying, oh, well, I was just reporting on what this person said about this person. That doesn't mean I actually believe it to be true. And as I go over more and more of these tactics of sophistry, you'll kind of start to notice that this is a pattern. Just about all journoid sophistry uses this rhetorical trick in some way. There's always a lifeline to their lies. There's always a way that they can slip out of what they said and go, oh, whoops, I didn't mean it that way. Or go, oh, well, that's just how the reader looked at it. Or, oh, well, that was just my opinion, man. There's always a plan B they have up their sleeve so that they can later save face. But anyway, let's move on and let's go back to Vtubergate a little bit. Going with this ridiculous Vice article on Kirche that seemed to start the whole thing. And so this is where we can see one of the basic fallacies that journos like to rely on. Because that's another tactic, that's another way they can worm out of lying, is that they can just intentionally use bad reasoning. And that way, when they're caught, they can just pretend that it was either just their opinion or they can just feign stupidity. And probably the easiest fallacy to spot is guilt by association. If you've ever seen Kirche's work before or watched her some of her streams, you'll know that she's at the absolute furthest just a general alt-light. In fact, probably not even that. She's really more like a centrist with some right-leaning ideas. And so it's a very big stretch to say that she's a Odysee. So one thing that journos do is they like to throw in guilt by association. Like this line right here. Meet Kirche Kirsche Verstal. One of her fans is a bona fide newtsie. Now, those of you who are intelligent, this one's kind of a pretty obvious one, but it's really important to understand just from statistics how ridiculous this kind of association fallacy really is. Like myself, for a simple example, at this point of me recording this, I've got just over 100k subscribers to my YouTube channel. Now, out of those 100k subscribers, I have people from all over the political spectrum, from all walks of life, holding all sorts of different opinions. There are some lefties who enjoy my content. There are some centrists who enjoy my content. There are Democrats and Republicans who enjoy my content. None of this changes the fact that I'm a libertarian. It's just that when you have tens of thousands of followers or hundreds of thousands of followers or subscribers or whatever, just from statistical likelihood, you're gonna grab some people from all walks of life. I even have some subscribers and followers and fans who disagree with most of what I have to say. They just watch my content because they like being contradicted or something, or other various reasons. There's always going to be tons and tons of reasons for why someone watches somebody else's content. You get a stadium filled with thousands of people, and no matter what it is, like just say it's a football game, there's going to be people who enjoy watching that game who have drastically different beliefs and come from very diverse cultures, etc., etc. It's just obvious statistical reality. Now, Kirsche, as me recording this, she has just under 90,000 subscribers, so very comparable to what I have. And so the same statistical reality applies. When you have 100,000 people and you make content like this, you're gonna get fans from all over the spectrum. And when you take that into perspective, it really just shows just how unfathomably stupid this is. To say, oh, one of their fans is les bad les wignot person. It's just from basic understanding of statistical reasoning, it is such a ridiculous thing to point out. And so this leads us to another important thing to understand about the modern corporate status journo, is that journos think you're stupid. No, seriously, corporate journos believe that their audience are the dumbest knuckle draggers on the planet. And I know I'm making kind of a journo tactic of my own here because I know that's kind of an unfalsifiable accusation. I'll get more into unfalsifiable accusations later. You can't really read someone's mind, but I have to say it because I genuinely think I'm right here. I'm pretty sure that Anna Valens, the person who wrote this hit piece, knows that guilt by association is a very stupid argument. Just because you have a fan who believes a certain way doesn't mean you agree with everything that fan believes. That's kind of a general line of reasoning you can use to remind yourself that journos know that they're lying when they use the guilt by association fallacy. If they truly believe that the person was X thing, then they would just accuse their target of being X thing. They wouldn't need the association fallacy if they genuinely believed what they were saying. Or a similar one is the whole, you follow this person on Twitter, therefore you must believe everything they believe. Which is ridiculous. A lot of times when you follow someone on social media, it's because you saw one post from them and you thought it was funny, so you want to see more posts. And sometimes you don't even know what it is they believe and you follow them. And yet they use the guilt by association anyway, even though it is a very stupid, very obviously fallacious argument, because they know that plebs fall for it. I've actually had the whole argument with someone before on, hey, following someone on social media doesn't mean you believe and agree with everything they say. And it's actually quite surprising how double-digit IQ people have a very difficult time wrapping their head around that concept. It is genuinely impossible to explain to certain people why guilt by association is not a good argument. And that's why journos use it. They use the guilt by association not because it's true, but because they know there are people out there who are dumb enough to believe it. Or at least they believe that a good portion of their audience is not smart enough to understand why just basic statistical reasoning tells you that this statement, one of her fans is Lenuzzi, doesn't have any relevant value. It doesn't actually tell you anything about what she actually believes. Corporate media outlets just know that many of their readers aren't that bright. That's it. That's why they do this. And that's very important to understand. In fact, probably one of the most important things to understand is that journos are professionals. They know exactly what they're doing. For example, Vice here is a very famous media outlet. A lot of these journos make pretty good money, definitely more money than I do. It is a middle upper class skilled job, which shows us that the journo knows that this is a fallacious argument. But again, journos are hired based on their ability to spin narratives. They are paid for their skills in gaslighting and sophistry. And another fallacy somewhat related to this that I went over this already in my general media dishonesty video, but let's also look at an example of it. It's just the general cherry picking fallacy. And this one's kind of easy to spot because a lot of times it's also combined as a guilt by association, but not all the time. Cherry picking can sometimes be a little bit more nuanced and require you to have knowledge of the subject for you to really notice the cherry picking, which is why it's also very, 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 very common. In fact, if I had to make a pie chart of the fallacies that journos tend to commit and chart it out by probability of them using this fallacy, just giving a simple ballpark estimate, I would say that that probably at least 50% of the logical fallacies that journos rely on is just cherry picking. Because in any given event, there's always going to be lots and lots of little things happening. And in any given subject, there's lots and lots of data. And so it's very easy for a journalist to simply take the data and take the information that agrees with their narrative, and then of course only show you that data. And it's kind of summarized by the age-old quote, "There are lies, damned lies, and statistics." If there are millions of pieces of evidence that discredit what a journalist is saying, and hundreds of pieces of evidence that agree with what the journo is saying, they can just write an article that only shows the hundreds of pieces of evidence that agrees with them. It is stupidly easy to cherry pick, it is stupidly easy to lie with statistics. And sometimes journos are just taking advantage of people's average levels of political ignorance. And this is where agenda setting theory comes into play. A very interesting thing about journalist sophistry is that if you look up the percentage chance of a thing to happen and the percentage chance of journos to report on it, one of the basic pieces of evidence we have that mainstream media is very dishonest these days is that these two statistics almost never line up. Most major media publications, they don't actually report on things based on any relation whatsoever in how likely those things are to actually occur. And since race-baiting wokeness is kind of the current dominant ideology of the cathedral, they tend to severely overreport minorities being victims of crimes. But of course, only when the perpetrator is either white or a police officer. And so your average kind of normie lib has a very skewed understanding of how often that actually occurs. And journos know that they have this power and they take advantage of it. And that's why we see this disconnect between the statistical chance of something happening and the statistical chance of mainstream media reporting on it. Journos in major publications know that they have been given the power to effectively control what plebs believe to be important. Plebs will assume that if the media is reporting on something, then that thing must be important to their own life, regardless of whether or not that's true. For instance, a lot of articles that covered BLM heavily misused statistics, resulting in a large number of people having a very skewed understanding of police data. For example, there was a survey that showed that a lot of very liberal people who were supporting BLM had allowed the media to lead them to believe that over 1,000 or so unarmed black men are shot and killed by the police every year, which is significantly higher than the numbers actually are. And a lot of this happens just from journos misusing statistics and disproportionately over or underreporting things, which then gives people kind of a false idea of how often certain things happen. And going back to Vtubergate, you can kind of just see this kind of dishonest cherry picking in obvious action. If we actually read that article titled "VTubing has an elephant in the room," we can quickly see how it's just a cherry-picking fallacy. That's all the article is. It's just Anna Valen's engaging in the typical criticism equals harassment grift, and then cherry-picking all the meanest things that could be found. Which is absurd, because if you say a stupid thing, or you write a stupid article, people are going to, en masse, call you out for being wrong. Mainstream media articles tend to get hundreds of thousands of views, sometimes millions of views, sometimes tens of millions of views. And so naturally, if an article is particularly bad and particularly filled with a lot of disinformation, it's gonna get called out a lot. And so then again, you run into a similar problem with guilt by association. Just basic statistical reasoning tells you that if you have tens of thousands of replies, some of those replies are gonna be yikesy things. So it's very easy to cherry pick the worst of it and claim, ooh, I'm being harassed. You know, the typical criticism equals harassment grift, which may be why it's kind of getting conflated with Gamergate, this whole Vtubergate, because it is, again, kind of the same dishonest journo tactic. If you don't remember Gamergate, the main grift behind Gamergate was just conflating criticism with harassment, and then cherry-picking the 1% of Gamergate posts they could find to claim that, oh, there's no credibility within Gamergate because these 1% of people are supposedly engaging in harassment. And of course, the journalists only focus on that 1%, ignore the rest of the 99% in order to deliberately ignore any kind of legitimate message. It's all done to gaslight the normies and pretend like, move along, people, there's nothing to see here. And of course, this cherry-picking often comes with a nice dose of completely ignoring why some people are upset about what a journo said. Which then brings us to the next sophistry tactic to talk about, which is that journos love to engage in classic Darvo, something that has become especially common in the days of social media. Journos will post a hit piece filled with misinformation, get pushback from social media about it, and then claim that they are the victims, when the journo was of course the one that started it with their original slanderous article. This is again known as Darvo, or deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. In this particular case, the timeline makes it pretty obvious. Anna posted a hit piece on Kirche that was filled with fallacious arguments and false accusations. The internet then of course proceeded to call out Anna on the lies and the false accusations and the fallacious arguments. And of course, because it's a Vice mainstream media article, it gets a lot of engagement. Tens of hundreds of thousands of people talking about it. And so then Anna Valens of course cherry picks the yikesiest ones that could be found and claims to be the victim of a lay harassment campaign, when Anna was the one that started the whole thing by writing the slanderous article in the first place. That is classic Darvo, reversal of victim and offender. Journos write ridiculous hit pieces or say stupid things, get called out for saying a stupid thing, and some of those call-outs are a little bit fiery, and so then the journo cherry picks the worst ones and claims to be the victim while completely ignoring the fact that they were the ones that started the whole thing. If you read this article, you'll notice that there's very little emphasis on how Anna Valente started it all. Journos absolutely love this abuse tactic. In fact, they love it so much that sometimes they'll even project it. They will engage in Darvo while accusing their target of engaging in Darvo. For example, look at this hit piece on Doge from Slate, crying about tens of thousands of public servants being fired because their contracts were canceled by the Department of Government Efficiency. And then, of course, it moves on to accusing the administration of Darvo, which is entirely projection. It ignores the reason why Doge canceled those public servant jobs, because they were jobs that were being done on taxpayer dime, even though they were jobs that didn't need to get done. And so the original victim, of course, here is the taxpayer. The government steals your money, spends it on their little pet projects, funneling billions of dollars to their little buddies and their little sinecures so that they can have a six-figure job where they don't actually do anything and they just sit on their butts, getting paid with money stolen from us, the US taxpayer. And so a lot of us voted in the previous election based on the fact that we don't really like this happening. And so then, of course, Doge cancels the contracts and Slate accuses them of Darvo, when this article itself is Darvo. This article is doing what it accuses Doge of doing, reversing the victim, the US taxpayer, who voted against this crap, and then painting the organization canceling these contracts, along with Elon Musk, as the offender. Which, again, when you know that taxation is theft, when you understand the reasons for why taxation is theft, this is completely ridiculous. The original offense was obviously the offense carried out at the US taxpayer. If someone stole 50% of the income of everybody living in a city, and then used that money to give one of their friends a board of directors of government consultants or something job, where they get paid mountains of money for a position that requires no actual responsibilities, everyone would look at that and consider that to be theft. That would be seen as the original offense. Which then kind of leads us to another issue, is that a lot of these corporate media journalists are what I like to again call statist journalists. They rely a lot on these authoritarian assumptions. This assumption that anything the government does is automatically good. At least when the party that the journalist likes is in power, of course. Because, you know, they're never actually consistent with their reasoning. The vast majority of journos are also partisan hacks. But you get the idea. Journos will write hit piece after hit piece after hit piece, and if you call them out on it, they will just play the victim. And another thing that happens here is that often other journalists will help them play the victim. Which brings up to another point that a lot of normies don't understand, is that most journalists have a lot of other journalists in their immediate social circle. And so when you see a whole bunch of journalists repeating the same narrative, a lot of normies look at that and they assume, oh, multiple news sources are saying the same thing, therefore it must be true. But the reality is this doesn't actually add that much credibility at all. Especially when they're playing the victim. Because of course, in this Vtubergate example, we see another journalist immediately jumping in to defend the honor of Anna Valente. But of course, when you read the article, it's just doubling down on the same fallacies as before. Just cherry-picking the worst posts they can find, doubling down on the guilt by association fallacy, doubling down on irrelevant arguments, doubling down on the misinformation. And so people really need to understand that journos defending other journos doesn't have any more credibility than a friend defending another friend. In fact, if anything, it has less credibility. But it's also important to understand why they do this, which becomes pretty apparent when we read further into the Jenkins article. We'll just read a little tidbit. Anna's ongoing plight has reached critical mass. The people advocating for Anna, anyone belonging to LGBTQIA+ communities and any other marginalized groups, to endlessly suffer. That's only one part of the truly disgusting equation. The other equally important part is, why are clear, unambiguous bigots and racists allowed major platforms? Why are they given sponsorships and brand deals? And of course, we have a leaflet up here with an image of a black man being enslaved. Except when you actually understand everything, you realize that the number of fallacies just in this image alone is off the charts. Because of course, journos aren't using reason at all. It's entirely moralistic. The real big grift here, the main ploy of the corporate media journal shill, is to trick the audience into thinking that they're the good guy. Journos always love to play the hero, and they will employ any number of false accusations in order to be able to do this. I mean, first off, just the accusation itself that these VTubers want minorities to endlessly suffer is, again, remember, based entirely on association fallacies combined with cherry-picking fallacies. They cherry-picked the absolute worst comments they could find, and then they're applying guilt by association to the targets they don't like against people who had no control over those comments. And so the journos are trying to play it it off as if the target of their smear is somehow responsible for what other people say, which is of course completely ridiculous. You'll also notice that the accusation is of course worded as a question, just to make it a nice loaded question, just to add another fallacy onto the list of fallacies in this. Rather than the accusation of them being a bigot and racist, it's the question, why are they bigots and racists? Why are the bigots and racists allowed platforms, blah blah blah. This might seem like a small, tiny little difference, but in terms of human psychology, it's actually very big. Loaded questions are just more likely to make it past people's reasoning filter, because by making it a question, it comes with the assumption that they're already right. Of course, when you know that the previous accusation was just based on cherry picking and guilt by association, associations which, by the way, are pretty questionable when you look into them, it becomes pretty obvious then that the assumption isn't even true. But by making it an assertion, by wording it as a question, it's all just adding to the pile of things that the reader needs to cognitively process in order to fully understand how they're being lied to, all while the journalist plays the good guy, all while they play the victim. Thus, there's a moralistic fallacy also added on top of all of these fallacies. And so what we're seeing here is a kind of mind overload tactic. Journos will often fire off fallacy after fallacy after fallacy in this kind of rapid-fire strategy in an attempt to overload the average person's cognitive capacity to notice the fallacies, where the journo is just twisting and contorting themselves into such an absolutely insane display of mental gymnastics and anti-logic that you might find yourself reading what a journo is saying, knowing that it's completely ridiculous, but you may find yourself having difficulty pointing out exactly why it's ridiculous. And that state of mind is actually intentional, because by making their arguments this ridiculous, it actually brings form a type of complexity. It's almost like you need to have a master's degree in bullshitology to be able to fully decipher and explain why what they're saying is incorrect. And that's another important thing about journos that a lot of people don't understand, other than just always playing the victim and always pretending to be the good guys, pretending to be the angel journo who's just shining a light on all the evils of the world. Another big thing to understand, and one of the reasons why so many corporate journos are actually very well paid, especially with cable TV personalities like Rachel Maddow or Anderson Cooper, the reason they're paid so well is because a lot of journos, what they really are, is they are expert psychological manipulators. When you see things like this, when you read things like this, you are actually the victim of attempted psychological abuse and gaslighting. That's what this crap really is. They are basically taking a tactic of brute forcing their way into people's minds. And it gets worse. Let's go back to our example here. See this picture of leaflet? This brings us to another journo tactic that is somewhat easy to understand, but not always easy to spot, which is that journoids lie by context, and they do this a lot more than you realize. Because lying by context is very, very easy to do, but you can only spot it by actually back-searching and researching the context of what they're saying. So in this example, we have a screenshot of leaflet with a black guy being enslaved, and no context provided other than it's YouTube. Although this particular example does kind of give a good idea of how you can possibly spot lying by context, as we notice that this picture has conveniently cut off the video title. Because of course, when you actually find this video on Leaflet and Asari's channel, suddenly the context of the image becomes obviously not exactly what it was originally being shown to be. She's just reacting to a video that got millions of views about how slavery is legal in the United States so long as the person has been convicted of a crime. So it's actually a completely innocuous video about prison labor. The thumbnail just looks like this because the original video used this thumbnail as clickbait. And of course, Dwayne Jenkins presents this image without any of that context. And then of course, taking the image taken without context and pairing it next to these false accusations. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the average normie pleb Vice reader? Your average brainwashed trash lib, what are they going to look at this image and think next to these accusations? Well, they're probably going to see the image and they're going to look at it as proof that this girl is just the evil bigot who wants to reinstate slavery. Which of course is not true at all. And of course is something that the journalists didn't actually say. They just cleverly worded things and cleverly included this image out of context in a way that a pleb might think that. Which brings us to another important thing to understand about journalist sophistry, tying into what I said earlier about psychological manipulation. The thing about mass manipulation, the thing about brainwashing, is that good, effective brainwashing isn't just done with basic misinformation. No, that's not the proper way to do it at all. Brainwashing works best and is most effective when the target of the brainwashing thinks they have reached the conclusion on their own. This journo isn't actually saying this about Leaflet. They're just heavily implying it in a way that, you know, your average pleb will reach that conclusion, even though it hasn't been told to them. And because the pleb reaches that conclusion without it being specifically outwardly told to them, The pleb then of course thinks that it's a genius conclusion that they reached on their own. And this is something I've actually seen a lot with boomer trash libs who watch people like Rachel Maddow here around in the Portland, Oregon area. Maddow does this kind of crap all the time, taking things out of context and adding snark to it in ways that trick the normies into coming into conclusions that aren't actually true. And because the normies think those conclusions on their own, they're more likely to believe that those conclusions are correct, without even realizing that they've actually just been led by the nose the whole time. Because going back to the leaflet post, what's your average pleb supposed to think when they see this image next to these accusations? Of course they're going to associate them together and have no idea that it's taken completely out of context and that it's completely irrelevant. And so while everything in this particular excerpt is extremely stupid, overall, it's actually genius tier brainwashing. And you may ask yourself, what the heck are you talking about, Mentis? That can't be correct. This is obviously dumb. It's obviously propaganda. Yes, it is, to those of us who think rationally. But do you think that rational thinkers are the target audience of mainstream corporate propaganda? No, of course not. Most people do not think rationally, and journos do not target rational thinkers. Most people think emotionally, and then they use reason later as a hamsterization process to look for reasons to believe what they came to conclusions via emotional reasoning. That is the target audience of this kind of propaganda. And the sad reality is the number of people who think this way is more than enough for this propaganda to be effective. The target audience of this crap show is not the type of person who looks at it and immediately notices the cherry-picking fallacy or the lying by omission, etc., etc. The target audience here is the person who sees the emotional language and sees the accusation of lay bigotry, immediately falls for the emotional manipulation, and thus they immediately fall for all of the journo sophistry tricks. I mean, just spend 10 minutes or so on places like Reddit/politics and you will see just how many people out there are completely lacking in basic critical thinking skills and fall for journo emotional brainwashing tactics all freaking day. That is the target audience. Because your average completely clueless r/politics Reddit midwit will absolutely eat this crap up. And because they reach the conclusion by drawing the association, the Redditoid will think that it's their own opinion. They will walk away from this article thinking, wow, all these horrible VTubers are evil Newtsies who want to reinstate slavery, and they will have zero understanding of how they were actually just brainwashed into thinking that. They will have no concept whatsoever of the absolute magnitude by which they were just manipulated. And this is how you know when we take a step back at things, when we really analyze crap like this. This is how we know that journalists know exactly what they're doing. At first glance, it's just stupid. But at second glance, we come to realize that this is actually very carefully crafted in a very specific way in order to manipulate the clueless normies into thinking a very specific thing. So what may at first glance just seem like a journo spurg out and just the usual hit piece article, the whole thing is actually part of a massive NPC factory operation. And so when you begin to understand the scale at which this sophistry is happening and why it's happening and what their goal is, that's when you start to really notice it everywhere, like going back into the previous article. What the heck is this here about? It's just a random 4chan shitpost. None of these three VTubers have anything to do with it, so it's just another combination of association fallacy with an out-of-context, irrelevant post. Very stupid, but at the same time, when you remember what the target audience of these kind of woke toy journalist posts are, you realize it's also, to some degree, kind of brilliant. Because it's presented without context, and so the reader will just look at it, make the association, and think that the association is their own opinion. And so once again, the Eternals r/politics Redditoid walks away thinking that they came to their own conclusion, when in fact they were simply brainwashed. On a logical level, those of us who are reasonable can see this and see it for what it is, just a very obvious false accusation. So a lot of times the knee-jerk response is to look at this and just laugh at how dumb it is. And again, logically, it is dumb, but you also have to understand why they do this. And the reason is because it works. Plebs, especially Cathedralite Church of Woke pew warmers, eat this stuff up all day long and fall for these tactics all the time. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. Once the reader is put into this almost kind of hypnotic state, journos then seal the deal using further sophistry tactics. And these can get a little bit subtle. For example, one of them is just negative and positive language. Because once the reader has been put in this state where they're now reasoning based on moralistic fallacy and other forms of emotional reasoning, it's very easy for the journo to then just use positive words and positive language for the things the journo wants them to believe, and negative language, negative words for things that they want the reader to negatively associate with or otherwise not believe. And these can be very simple, otherwise innocuous seeming things. Like for example, the word transphobic, used against someone criticizing trans activism. By adding phobic to the word, rather than an honest analysis of what that criticism was, it instead has a point to paint the opposition with the negative language of phobia, to imply that they are simply fearful of other ideas. And then for this explanation, Valens uses the word objectively to try and add positive language to this negative language, to make it seem like what is being said is just a truthful, objective statement of fact, when in reality it's just another form of sophistry. And when we look outside of Vtubergate, this can actually get pretty darn insane. For instance, some journos will combine negative and positive language with non-colloquial language, so equivocating on words in ways that they know their readers will not actually understand. This isn't always easy to spot, but there's a very common one that happens all the time and was present very much in the Vtubergate thing. And that, of course, is equivocating on the meaning of race and ethnicity, etc., in order to concoct some very bizarre strawman arguments. Because most people, when they hear the word racism, they assume it means ethnic collective guilt. But of course, there's also that non-colloquial definition that racism equals prejudice plus power. And from that, they conclude that anything that sustains a racial collective inequity is therefore lay racism, even though no honest person thinks like that when they hear this word. So for instance, Anna's evidence of Kirche engaging in lay racism is actually just this incredibly stupid Twitter post accusing her of being racist for criticizing South Africa's BBBEE laws, while also falsely claiming that those who criticize those laws are only white supremacists. Again, no honest person uses these terms this way, because it's just objectively true that South Africa's Black economic empowerment laws are racist. Those laws are, in fact, specifically designed to take resources from white people and give them to black people in South Africa in order to right some collective wrong. And the party that supports this system is, in fact, a communist party, as in they identify as a communist party. And so when you understand this, you realize that the accusation, of course, is very obviously false. But journalists, of course, tell themselves that as long as they equivocate on a term that is actually used in some way, in some fashion, then, well, it's technically not a false accusation. And sometimes these equivocations combined with other types of fallacies. For example, a lot of times when talking about the Great Replacement, and using it as a way to accuse someone of being lay white supremacist. Now, there's two ways to look at the Great Replacement. One is as a conspiracy theory that it's a deliberate, organized effort to genocide all the white people, but then there's another way to look at it as just an observable demographic trend, pointing to data showing declining birth rates among white populations in Western countries, and of course, increased immigration from non-Western nations. So for example, the US Census Bureau projects that by 2045 or so, white people will no longer be the majority in the United States, just due to these observable birth rates and immigration patterns. And it's also an observable fact that many politicians have an incentive to maintain this current demographic trend in data. And so what journos will do is they will use their equivocation on the meaning of what is and what isn't racism, and what is and what isn't white supremacy, to suggest that anybody who simply acknowledges this data that again is objectively verifiable, but by the magic of their equivocation and strawman arguments, anybody who acknowledges these facts as real becomes a white supremacist, which is of course completely ridiculous. Whoa ho ho, look at this data compiled by the United States Census Bureau. Do you see the data? Oh wait, no guys, don't look at the data. If you see this data, you magically become a white supremacist. Don't acknowledge the data, guys. And again though, you have to remember, it's intentionally stupid. It's not meant to trick rational people, it's meant to trick Reddit midwits. Because in the crazy land of corporate media status journalism, you're allowed to lie as much as you want, so long as you again have an exit strategy. As long as there's some ridiculous pedantic nugget of truth the journal can cling to, they know that their lies can be defended. And honestly, with Vtubergate, it's kind of one of the easier ones to spot these. Normally all these tactics, like taking things out of context, are done in the context of taking studies out of context. Journos misusing studies, journos using discredited studies, in some cases using studies that were discredited and retracted by the very authors of those studies, and yet the journos keep citing those studies. Along with the good old-fashioned tactic of treating soft and hard science the same. Because, you know, a social science study that simply surveyed people about how they feel about a certain subject is, you know, totally just as objectively valid as a computer science study about how to speed up the latest processors. But of course, journos will treat anybody who has questions about the former as just as much as a quote-unquote science denier as someone who questions the latter. And thus the journos can cover themselves with an additional layer of false credibility by simply cherry-picking the correct experts, and pretending like the evidence is on their side when in reality it isn't. But fortunately, as complex as journalist sophistry can get, you'll be able to see through most of it if you remember two things. The first of these things is to remember that corporate statist journoids are really just paid propagandists. The days when they had any kind of credibility are long gone. Because there's a saying out there that the corporate media is being slowly replaced by the internet. That the internet is becoming the prime way of discerning facts. And the reality is, with the exception of a few primary source reporters, this replacement has already happened. Most corporate media outlets are already nothing more than propaganda outlets. And this becomes just obviously apparent when you know how to spot their psychological manipulation tactics. And so just kind of knowing that they aren't really credible will help you through the first step. Because a lot of journos rely entirely on a confidence trick. They rely on the naivete of the average pleb. Because they know that the average person would think, oh hey, this is a well-known news publication. They would never tell such outrageous, blatant lies. And journos basically take advantage of that good faith. People assume that nobody would lie as brazenly as journos do these days. And that's actually the first thing that opens them up to being brainwashed. And what this means is that journos are paid the big bucks to take advantage of what's known as the just world hypothesis. The average lib assumes that we live in a somewhat just, somewhat sane world where our intellectual institutions have not been subverted by psychopaths. People want to believe that mainstream media is somewhat, at least basically trustworthy, because that then allows them to believe that there's some rightness in this world. A lot of people don't want to accept these facts because they don't want to accept the fact that you can't really rely on the media for truth anymore. That's kind of a scary reality for a lot of normies. And journos take advantage of this. The average pleb goes to these publications and just reads things with an open mind, having no idea that what they're reading is carefully designed to assault their senses in a way to gaslight them into believing things that aren't true. And so just simply being aware of that and not giving journalists good faith will generally prevent you from falling for most of their schemes. And then the second thing to be aware of is to understand that journalist sophistry in general really just falls under the case of pedantic correctness. Because the common criticism against journalists is that they're just telling half-truths and spin jobs, etc., etc. But a lot of people don't really understand how to explain why a half-truth is a whole lie. I see people saying that, oh yes, a half-truth is a whole lie, but not everybody fully really understands why this is. And the answer is just how pedantic correctness works. I did a whole video on pedantic correctness and how it's kind of the mating cry of midwittery. But the TLDR, the best way to understand it in kind of a condensed form, is that pedantic correctness is when the claim on its surface is correct, but the point it is trying to make or the point it is implying is false. And most pseudo-intellectualism falls under this idea that you can pretend to be right so long as you are partially right, which is pretty much what journos do. And so it's important to understand the reason why half-truths are actually full lies is because just because you're correct on something doesn't mean the point you are making is true. And of course, the central point that journalists are trying to make is really what matters. That's what the reader is going to walk away believing. And so when the vast majority of readers walk away from an article believing something that isn't true, well then that means the journo probably lied, and we probably shouldn't be giving him as much credibility as we do. And considering this happens pretty much all the time these days, then well, perhaps we've already reached the point where the credibility of journos should be seen in about around the same light as a used car salesman. And that's pretty much all I have to say. I'll be doing more videos on this particular topic in the future, but for now that's good enough because it's kind of important just to understand the rabbit hole, just kind of in general. So that is all, and thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, or by again checking out Ground News. Thanks again for watching. That is all. Till next time.